Hi, I'm Brett, a third-rate YouTuber and pseudo-expert from papercartridges.com, and today we're going to be talking about a little-known campaign of the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. And in this campaign, the muzzle-loading rifle-musket holds its own, and sometimes it even defeats the Prussians who are armed with the famous needle rifle, the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr. So this is the campaign of the mine, and in this campaign, the Prussians are up against Austria's German allies, mostly in southern Germany. And just for time today, we're going to specifically focus on the Royal Bavarian Army. But what's so fascinating about this campaign is that it is almost the complete opposite of what we see happening in Bohemia, where Prussia is fighting against Austria in the campaign that leads up to the decisive battle at Königgrätz. And this is where we get our popular idea about the Dreyse needle rifle. It comes primarily from the Königgrätz campaign. So this huge victory over the Austrians who are armed with rifle muskets. And of course, the Dreyse is a bolt-action breech-loading rifle with a very high rate of fire for its day. So 6 or 7 rounds per minute. Prussian soldiers can load and fire it from the prone. And with the muzzle loader, you have to stand to load it. It takes 20 to 30 seconds per round, so a rate of fire of maybe 2 to 3 rounds per minute. And we covered this in the last video on the channel. We looked at the Dreyse needle rifle in context in the Bohemian campaign and how the Prussians adopted a new way of focusing on fire tactics, Feuertaktik, where they rely on the firepower from their Dreyse rifles to win on the battlefield, while the Austrians embraced shock tactics, so Stoßtaktik, mass assaults with densely packed columns of troops charging at the enemy to overcome them with the bayonet, and deliberately not doing very much shooting in this. So in the Bohemian campaign, up to and including Königgrätz, when the Prussians defeat the Austrians, it is a total lopsided, crushing, decisive result. I mean, the Austrians are cooked. The Austrian casualties are 4 times higher than the Prussians, for instance. But in the campaign of the Main, we have the Prussians who are still armed with the Dreyse needle rifle, and we have the Bavarians armed with a rifle musket that is very similar than the Austrian rifle. It's the same caliber. And we don't see this total lopsided, crushing Prussian victory in the campaign of the Main. And instead, in the official Prussian history of the War of 1806, the Prussians say what happened against Bavaria in the campaign of the Main was a completely different picture. The Bavarian and Prussian armies here were about the same size, so no one really has the numerical advantage. And the casualties in this campaign are pretty much equal between Bavaria and Prussia. So we have to ask, why did the Dreyse totally annihilate the Austrians who had rifle muskets, but not the Bavarians who also had rifle muskets? So if the needle rifle really is this game-changing technology that it is popularly made out to be, why did it struggle to defeat the Bavarians? And this is the even nerdier deep dive that we're going to do today. And I'm probably going to make a lot of the Dreyse fanboys really mad. I can't wait to read the comments, as always. But to set the background here, the Austro-Prussian War is really a terrible name for this war, because the war was much bigger than just Austria and Prussia. There were 3 major ground campaigns in the war, and a naval campaign even in the Adriatic. The largest ground campaign was in Bohemia, so that's the main armies of Prussia and Austria, and they're the ones that end up fighting at Königgrätz. There's a smaller campaign between Austria and Italy, which Austria actually manages to win. And then we have the campaign of the Main, where Prussia is dealing with Austria's German allies, primarily Hanover, Baden-Württemberg, and of course Bavaria. Now, Austria's allies in Germany on paper are very dangerous. They make up about 70% of what is modern day Germany. So in a perfect world, in theory, they could raise 200, maybe even 250,000 troops, and this would be an absolute game-changing number. And Prussia has to deal with Austria. Austria is the great power, so the main bulk of the Prussian armies have to go into Bohemia for the Königgrätz campaign, and that leaves only about 50,000 Prussian troops to deal with all of the Austrian German allies, who in theory should be able to raise 200,000 or more troops. So why did Prussia win this campaign? Yeah, spoiler alert, Prussia wins. Did they win because of the Dreyse needle rifle giving them this massive technological superiority that evens the odds? Well, no. To explain how Prussia actually won, we have to go back about 16 years. Like I said, this is a really nerdy deep dive. We're going back to 1850, to one of the most important military events that you've never heard of. In 1850, Austria and Prussia are bickering. The revolutions of 1848 have just ended, and Prussia was trying to start its own union up in the north with the cool kids. And Austria is saying, no, 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 you're going to stay part of the German Confederation, which Austria dominates. And the discussions go nowhere. This is the autumn crisis of 1850. And so finally, Prussia says, you know, enough. We're going to mobilize. So Prussia mobilizes. They go to raise their army to be ready to fight, because when it comes down to it, an army is the last argument of king. So if you really want to press your case on something, you have to have an army. And this mobilization turns out to be a ridiculously humiliating disaster for Prussia, a complete failure. The Prussians are unable to mobilize their armies. They can't get the army ready. They can't get it in position and ready for combat on the border in time. So the army fails the country here in 1850. And that means Prussia, they don't have an army, the Austrians do. The Austrian army is ready to go. So Prussia has to submit to the Austrian demands. There is a preliminary agreement signed at Olmütz, the punctation of Olmütz. And basically, Prussia agrees to all of Austria's terms, and they agree to be part of the Austrian-dominated German Confederation. Bismarck calls this the humiliation of Olmütz, and the Prussians never forget it. They resolve in 1850, after this embarrassment, this will never happen to us again. So Prussia then goes to reorganize their army, and much more importantly, Prussia empowers their great general staff. So previously, the general staff were a bunch of nerds who were in a stuffy room somewhere in the War Department looking at maps and reading military history. But now the general staff is empowered to meticulously plan for the next mobilization, so that when the king needs an army next time, that army is ready to go. It's on the border. It's ready to fight before our enemies are. So we fast forward now. We go back to 1866, and here we go again. Prussia and Austria are now bickering, of all things, over who gets to be the Duke of Schleswig. And it looks like it is going to come to war. And again, Prussia mobilizes. And this time it is a night and day improvement over 1850. So Prussia in 1866 has a much smaller population and a smaller military than Austria and her allies. But Prussia gets their armies where they need to be faster. And this, at the end of the day, this is why Prussia won. We can talk all day about the differences in the guns and breech loaders and muzzle loaders and range and velocities and all this stuff. The reason Prussia won is that at the end of the day, they were ready for this war before everyone else was. So Prussia put their armies ready to go, mobilized on the border. The Prussians are all dressed up and ready for the ball, and Austria and Austria's allies are all still rummaging through their drawers looking for their socks. So the war begins, and Prussia is ready. They invade Bohemia. The Austrians aren't ready. They cannot stop the invasion. And the Prussians drive the Austrians back, and they crush them at Königgrätz, only a few weeks into the active phase of the war. So on July 3rd, 1866, Prussia defeats Austria at Königgrätz, and Austria is basically out of the war at this point. And the same thing happens in Germany. So the Prussians field this army of 50,000 troops. It's much smaller than what on paper the German allies of Austria are able to field, but the 50,000 man Prussian army is ready to go, and the Austrian allies are not. So the Prussians pounce on Hanover. Hanover was the most capable of Austria's allies, and they take them out. There's one battle. Hanover actually wins it, but then they immediately surrender. They see the writing on the wall. And so the Prussian army, now the Army of the Main, turns south, and it starts heading towards Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria right at the start of July. So like July 1st, 1866, the Prussians are coming. And they have an army, and their army is ready, but Austria's allies, so Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria, they are still trying to mobilize. They're still trying to find their socks. The Royal Bavarian Army had promised their allies, said, we will have a standing army of 70,000 troops, and we will have 114,000 reserves. So on paper, this gives the Bavarian army a theoretical end strength of 184,000 troops. At the end of the war, 3.5 months into the war, the Bavarians had only managed to raise 20,000 of their reserves, and they fielded an army of 55,000. So they brought about 1/3 of the total strength of what they had promised. The Bavarian war effort was slow, disorganized, unmotivated. They were never ready. They spent the entire campaign of the Main reacting to Prussian moves. Like many other European armies at this time, the Bavarians conscripted soldiers into their army for a theoretical 6-year term of service, but after an initial year or so of training, they furloughed their soldiers to save money. They just sent them home. They said, hey, you're on call. If we need you, come back, bring your boots back when we call you. So their army is not particularly well trained, especially in marksmanship. The Bavarians did not train their soldiers anywhere up to the standard you might be familiar with, the British, for instance, or the Prussians. But the Bavarians do have one key advantage as this campaign opens, and that is their rifle. So let's talk about the guns for a while. That's probably why you came here. Logistics, trains, mobilization, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's what wins wars, but we want to talk about the guns. And it is fair, though, to consider the guns in more detail here in the middle and into the late 19th century, because in this era, it's the infantry small arms that is bringing the firepower to the battlefield. So artillery and cavalry help a bit. But from the 1860s through to the start of the First World War, it is the infantryman's, the normal grunt's rifle that is bringing the vast majority of the firepower to the battlefield. And we can see this in the casualties. The American Civil War, 90% of battlefield casualties in the Civil War were from small arms, from rifles. It's 80% in the Franco-Prussian War. Into the 20th century, Russo-Japanese War, 75% of Japanese casualties were from rifles, from the Russian rifles. So if there's any era where comparing the arcane details of the rifles might actually matter, it's the era we're in right now, so the mid-19th century. And the Bavarians are armed with the model 1858 Podewils rifle. And this is named after the director of the Bavarian rifle factory at Amberg, who designed it. He also designed the bullet. I want one, but they are incredibly rare. They didn't make very many of them to begin with, and after the war, almost all of them got converted into breech loaders. So the only way I might be able to get one might be to rob a museum or something. Just going to jump in here quick to say that Chase, a friend of the channel, has a Podewils rifle and has generously sent me some pictures to use for this video. Thank you, Chase. But it's an excellent rifle. it is probably the best rifle musket ever. And I know I've said that about the Lorenz, which is true for the rifle muskets of a great power, but the 1858 Podewils rifle is the apotheosis of the rifle musket. So it's a 13.9 millimeter rifle, but it has a unique central fire ignition system, and it was matched up with a very cleverly designed Podewils bullet, and that gave it performance off the charts compared to other rifle muskets of this era. As the chap would say from Bullock on the Range, the Podewils rifle uses a French-style cartridge. In the English-speaking world, we would call it an Enfield-style cartridge, but basically the bullet gets loaded, wrapped in a paper patch that forms kind of a primitive form of bullet jacket. And what that results in, there's no lead touching the barrel, so you can ramp up the velocity of this bullet without streaking lead down your barrel, and the grease-soaked paper patch helps control the fouling, so you can just keep firing and firing and firing. The fouling doesn't really build up and make it difficult to load. The Podewils rifle has an extremely flat trajectory for black powder. So for black powder, it's coming in just shy of 1,300 feet per second. Now for you modern rifle guys, that might sound like a squib load, but for black powder, this is insane. 1,300 feet per second out of a 54 caliber rifle musket is insane. And people tend to make a big deal about velocity and trajectory, but the rule of thumb is the flatter your trajectory is, the closer the bullet stays to the ground, the more chances you have for a hit, even if your aim is a little shaky or your aim is a little bit off, or your soldiers are just firing in the general direction of the enemy, which is most common in a combat setting. I don't have a Podewils rifle, but I do have the next best thing. I have an original Lorenz, which I have shot with the Podewils bullet. And this experimental archaeology absolutely confirms the incredible performance that the primary sources describe. The bullet and the rifle for rifle muskets has an incredibly long danger space. So as long as you aim low, the bullet's going to stay within the height of a soldier out from the muzzle to over 350 yards, and that's insane. Again, for 1860s, it's like off the charts. But speaking of slower bullets, the Prussian infantry, meanwhile, they have the model 1841 Dreyse, that's Zündnadelgewehr. And it is a 25-year-old design by this point. It's a large bore 1830s, 1840s design. It's heavy, it's fairly crude, it leaks gas, and even though it has an upgraded cartridge by this time, it has the model 1855 cartridge, the Dreyse bullet is about 25% slower than the Podewils bullet, and it is not very accurate at all beyond about 250 yards. So the Prussians start to worry about this in the early 1860s as these last generation rifle muskets are getting more accurate with longer and longer range. And the Prussians start to ask themselves, is this going to be a problem? And this was answered by Major Cesar Rustov, a Prussian officer, firearms expert. Remember his name for a little bit later, we'll hear from him again. But he wrote one of the most influential books on rifles and projectiles of this era in 1857, Die Kriegshandfeuerwaffen. And odds are you have seen illustrations from this book before. At the logo for the channel, in fact, the compression bullet is from his book. And I also like Rustov because his German, it is technical, but it's easier to read. It's not super technical. So for a dumb American who's still learning German, I appreciate it because it is a little bit easier for me to read. But he also wrote another book in 1862 on the new rifled infantry weapons. And he says, yes, the answer to the question is yes, the Dreyse is still competitive, even though there are new weapons. The new rifle muskets, like the Podewils rifle, they have longer range, they're more accurate, But that is not really what's most important. What's most important is rate of fire within the range of 250 yards. That is more important than having better accuracy at 500 yards. And Rostov is arguing that firepower is more effective up close. So inside 200, maybe 250 yards, that is where the Dreyse's rate of fire really matters. Rostov says a lot of really good things about the Podewils rifle. In fact, he considers it to be very capable, very accurate. He does respect it. But the Dreyse, which is older, has a slower bullet velocity, it's kind of crude, but he still says inside 200 yards where fire really starts to take effect, the Dreyse owns the field. So what we end up with as the campaign of the Main begins, you have the Bavarians who have a very accurate long-range rifle musket that fires 2 or 3 rounds a minute, and the Prussians have an aging breech loader that's not very accurate beyond 250 yards, but it can fire 6 or 7 rounds per minute. So each one has their strengths and weaknesses. But the key thing to remember here is that Bavaria did not follow Austria in embracing the bayonet-centered Stoss tactic. The Austrian general, leading up to the Battle of Königgrätz, told his soldiers, don't waste your time with useless shooting. Maneuver, get close, and then charge. Meanwhile, the Bavarian chief of staff, General von der Tann, would be a great name for a battle cruiser, by the way. Von der Tann, by the way, was born on the same day as the Battle of Waterloo. But he's the chief of staff for the Bavarian army, and he thinks the Austrian obsession over shock tactics is a huge mistake. Von der Tann went to the Schleswig War as an observer, so he saw the Prussians fighting at Dibbel. He saw the needle rifle in action, and it impressed him greatly. The Austrians also saw the needle rifle in action, but the Austrian takeaway was, yeah, we can still take them with a bayonet charge. Von der Tann looks at the needle rifle and says, no. The very worst thing we can do is bayonet charge these Prussians with the needle rifle, because we are conceding our one key advantage if we do that, and that is the long-range accuracy of the Podewils rifle. Von der Tann said the Podewils rifle shoots twice as well at 600 to 800 paces as the needle gun, but it does have half of the rate of fire. Therefore, he comes to the obvious conclusion, we have to use defensive tactics. We have to hold our position and make the Prussians come at us. If the Prussians have to advance on us, then they can't go prone. They have to stand up, they have to move, and if they're shooting while they're moving, well, great, they're not going to be very accurate doing that, and we've got them. So, okay, we finally have come to the actual campaign of the Main, and Prussia's army, as we've discussed, is very well organized, they're well prepared, and the Bavarians are slow, they're ponderous, they're timid, they lack purpose, they're lackadaisical, they're indecisive, they're directionless. These are all terms that the Bavarians describe themselves with, by the way, in their official history after the war. So this isn't me just insulting Bavarians. They had the presence of mind afterwards to reflect on their own shortcomings. But as disorganized as the Bavarians were, tactically, they fought surprisingly well, and the battles essentially went as von der Tann had envisioned. And the Prussians and Bavarians finally meet for the first major battle of the campaign on July 4th, 1866, and this is at the Battle of Dernbach. And the Prussians are attacking, so the Prussian fire is not all that accurate, and like von der Tann had understood, they can't just go prone. The Prussians have to get up, stand up to advance. And the Bavarians are defending, and they are using the accuracy and range of the Podewils rifle to their advantage. And this means that Dernbach is a very hard-fought engagement, and the Bavarians generally hold their positions in this battle. So right from the start, the campaign of the Main isn't following the pattern that we saw in Bohemia. So with the Austrians, the Prussians would approach and the Austrians would launch bayonet assaults. The Prussians would go prone frequently. They would just gun down the Austrians at short range and shoot them to ribbons. The Dreyse can't miss when the Austrians are charging tightly packed assault columns right up to their muzzles. So in Bohemia, there's one lopsided total Prussian victory, one after another after another. At Dernbach, it is a firefight, and each side is relying on the firepower of infantry small arms here. It is Rifle-Musket against Dreyse breechloader, and it ends up as a stalemate. Tragically, though, one of the Prussian officers who is killed by a Podewils bullet at Dernbach is Major Cesar Rustov. He is leading an assault on a hill near Zella, and it's kind of a sad irony that this expert on infantry weapons, an advocate of fire tactics, he gets killed by a rifle-musket while he's essentially leading a bayonet assault. And his brother, Wilhelm Rustov, who wrote a history of the campaign later on, he said the Bavarians did not find that the needle gun was superior to the Podewils rifle, and he even mentioned Zella, where his brother had been killed, as one of the examples of the Podewils rifle's performance. So Dernbach is fought on July 4th, 1866. It's a day after the Battle of Königgrätz. And the Battle of Dernbach is almost over when news of the Austrian disaster finally arrives, and the Bavarians start to think, holy crap, we are on our own now. So the Bavarians fall back after dark to a more defensible position. Bavarians also at this point didn't really expect to win this war, but now they are fighting on home ground, and they're also fighting to end up with a better position when it comes to negotiations to end the war. The largest battle of the Main campaign was at Kissingen on July 10th, and the Bavarians had fallen back to defend the river crossing here. And the Prussians had a very hard time at Kissingen. The Bavarians, though, once again, they're not very well prepared. They were not ready, and they're not really taking this war all too seriously, because if they really wanted to stop the Prussians from coming across the river, they might have blown up the bridges, but instead they decide just to barricade the bridges. They pile a bunch of crap up on the bridges because the war's going to be over soon, and we really don't want to blow up our bridge and then we're going to have to spend money to rebuild it later. But the Prussians attack. They're taking accurate fire from the Bavarians, from the Podewils rifles, as they are attacking. But the Prussians are still able to smash through the barricades on the bridges, even though they're kind of being shot to ribbons while this is going on. So they're under fire the whole way. The Prussians also figure out a couple other ways to get across the river, so they end up coming at Kissingen from multiple directions. And the Prussians here, true to form, they're moving fast, they're being flexible, they're being adaptive, and the Bavarians are slow and they're constantly getting surprised. The battle turns into an urban fight. Even here, though, the Podewils rifle holds its own, even though the Dreyse does have the higher rate of fire. But ultimately, the Bavarians have to retreat out of Kissingen. They fall back through a cemetery, they fall back through some villages. The Prussians advance on them the entire way, and they're getting shot up every step of the way. And the Bavarians end up burning through their ammunition. The Bavarian soldiers fire their 80 rounds that they had. Again, this is a real firefight. And the battle smolders on until nightfall, when the Bavarians finally are out of ammo and they retreat under the cover of darkness. So technically, the Battle of Kissingen is a Prussian victory, The Prussians, after all, they crossed the river, they took the town, they drove the Bavarians back, but it wasn't easy, and the Prussian casualties here ended up higher than the Bavarians. So by this point, we're maybe 2 weeks or so into the campaign of the Main, and the Bavarians have not been able to stop the Prussian advance, but that is more because of how unprepared and reactive the Bavarians were at the operational level, rather than any supposed superiority of the Dreyse over their rifle-musket. And we even see the Bavarians praising the Podewils rifle. There's a letter from a Bavarian officer published after Kissingen. He says he prefers the Podewils rifle. And the Bavarian soldiers don't feel like they are at a disadvantage with this rifle musket. They have absolute confidence in their rifle. In the Bavarian primary sources, there's one word that appears a lot, and it's the Podewils rifle is sicher, which is German for certain, it's sure, it's accurate. What we aim it at, it's going to hit. The Bavarian soldiers also appreciate that the Podewils rifle is much lighter than the model 1841 Dreyse, and the ammunition is also lighter, so soldiers can carry more rounds. And the campaign continued for a few more weeks. There is a series of smaller engagements, but we don't see any Prussian blowout decisive victories. We also don't see any panicked Bavarian retreats. These are equally fought battles where the casualties are roughly the same for either side. And there is kind of a final irony in this unusual campaign, because the very last battles of the campaign of the Main were also the last battles of the Austro-Prussian War, and they're also the very last gasp of the rifle-musket in any European war. So in these last battles at Rossbrunn and Oettingen on July 26, 1866, the Bavarians end up the undisputed winners. They hold their ground. The Prussians advance on them, but they cannot drive the Bavarians back. So the Prussians end up, especially at Rossbrunn, they end up shot to ribbons. And it is kind of ironic that the rifle musket wins its very last battle in history, and it wins going up against the Dreyse needle rifle. And both during and after the campaign, the Bavarians never blame the needle rifle for causing their eventual defeat. And conspicuously absent from the period literature are these descriptions of how the Prussian needle rifle just blew them away. Austria, meanwhile, only 2 days after the Battle of Königgrätz, so on July 5th, 1866, there's newspaper headlines in Austria saying that the Prussians beat us with a hell machine, that this hell machine is so powerful that the heroes of the past, like legendary superhero figures, can't even stand up against it. So it's not our fault we lost. Don't blame the Austrian army for losing, because no mere mortal could stand up against this Dreyse needle rifle hell machine. What we do see in the literature is literally the opposite, though, with the Bavarians. They say, our Podewils rifle let us stand up to the Dreyse. So even though the battles don't go very well for Bavaria, they never blame the needle rifle for their defeats. Von der Tann praised the Dreyse. He said it's an excellent weapon, but he never blamed it for defeating his army. The Bavarian fire was very effective. It was surprisingly effective considering how poorly trained they were. You can imagine if they had been trained like the British army was in this period, what that would have looked like. But Bavarian soldiers, nonetheless, they still had confidence in their rifle. They didn't feel underarmed. Some of them called it the best rifle in the world. So the Bavarians felt the Podewils rifle had at least proven itself equal to the Dreyse. And these battles between Bavaria and Prussia, they're shooting battles. They are not bayonet assaults. There were some bayonet assaults, but they're mostly decided by fire. And in these firepower-driven battles, the rifle-musket held its own. Von der Tann absolutely made the right decision to fight defensively, use the advantage of the Podewils rifle. It kind of makes you wonder what would have happened if the Austrians had fought defensively and used the Lorenz rifle. But in the official Bavarian history of the war, the official report in 1868, the word Zündnadelgewehr does not even appear once. And there's no insistence in the official Bavarian history that the enemy had the better gun. The Bavarians, they mention things like lebhaftes Feuer from the Prussians, so like lively fire from the Prussians. And after the war, the Bavarians quickly convert their Podewils muzzleloaders into breech loaders. They shoot the same bullet, it has the same caliber, it's the same ballistic performance, but it gives them a higher rate of fire. So it's the best of both worlds. Now the Austrians, on the other hand, the official Austrian history of the war gives their official narrative that the needle rifle was just too much for the brave, heroic Austrian soldiers to overcome. Page after page of the official Austrian history is the needle rifle did this, the needle rifle did that. And this becomes the Austrian propaganda narrative, you could say. And the Dreyse becomes a scapegoat for the Austrian leadership, that the cause of our defeat isn't the leadership of the Austrian army, it's this hell machine that beat us. We had no chance. We were stuck with this old Lorenz musket that the pinching bureaucrats foisted on us. We didn't have any other choice. And this propaganda is so effective that people still believe it today. And if you question it, they will call you a third-rate YouTuber. And Kaiser Franz would be very happy. But not all Austrians went along with the propaganda line, though. There was at least one in particular, Colonel Edward Bartels, who had resigned from the Austrian army in 1866 so that he could write about the reasons for Austria's defeat. And he's pointing out the obvious here. He says, we had a 13.9 millimeter rifle musket, and the Bavarians have a 13.9 millimeter rifle musket. We got our butts kicked in embarrassing lopsided defeats, and we claim that the needle rifle did this to us. But the Bavarians, they fought the same needle rifle we did, and they held their own. In fact, they held their ground several times against the needle rifle. So Bartels says Austria didn't lose because the needle rifle was too much for us to overcome. Austria lost for other reasons. And this refreshing bit of honesty was enough to get him arrested and charged. Even though he was retired, actually turned into kind of a big scandal, the Bartels affair. But the Prussians also observed that the Main campaign was nothing at all like the Bohemian campaign against Austria. And the official Prussian history of the war said that the Main campaign was a completely different picture. The Prussians admitted that it was much easier going against the Austrians. They just had to pump rounds into these densely packed assault columns at close range. You know, the Austrians charged in so close that you just can't miss. But against the Bavarians, it's a hard slog. There's roughly equal casualties, and it's a much tougher fight. So at the end of all of this, the campaign of the Main doesn't prove necessarily that the needle rifle or the Podewils rifle musket was better. What it does prove is that being grossly unprepared and uncoordinated and clumsy and squandering all your advantages is the fastest way to lose. The Prussians pounced fast. They mobilized quickly. They were ready so much sooner. The Prussians were famous for being ready to fight the moment they got off the trains. The Bavarians, when they detrained, it took days for them to sort themselves out, figure out who's in what unit, where am I supposed to go. They're constantly reacting throughout this campaign. They moved blind. They had very poor reconnaissance. They didn't know where the enemy was. So I would say the Bavarians could have been armed with whatever the most advanced rifle was in 1866. So they could have Spencer magazine repeater rifles. They could have Snyder's, Chassepot's, Henry's, you name it. Whatever you think the best gun in the world in 1866 is, give it to the Bavarians, and they still would have lost. And they would have lost for the same reasons that France loses in 1870, even though they have the much more advanced Chassepot rifle and the Prussians are still hauling around the clunky old Dreyse. And it's just because the Prussians in the mid-19th century are doing war on a completely other level. But when the armies met in the campaign of the Main, it came down to the battlefield. It was not this easy, overwhelming Prussian cakewalk. And in the very final battles in Europe, where one side is armed with a rifle-musket, the takeaway here is it was close. So this was the time that the rifle-musket almost beat the Prussian needle rifle. I think we've rambled on long enough for for one day, for another nerdy deep dive video. I'm Brett from papercartridges.com. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.